enough yit yakking, Jeff. We're tired of listening to you talk. You've been asking for it. Tonight it happens. I want everybody to throw your hype hands up, drop the narwhals in chat. I cannot even begin to explain to you how excited I am. Please put it together, drop the bits for our guest tonight, the one and only, the greatest, Miss Patty Degnan. She is a program manager at Google. And with that being said, her opinions, anything she says here tonight are hers and hers alone and are not reflective of her current employer. She's also the former director of information security and GRC at Looker, Informatica, as well as others. Your background is incredibly impressive, Patty. You got over 10 years of experience in audit and compliance. So thank you so very much for joining us tonight. Would you like to take a minute and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction. So my background is essentially, or started in information security, well, probably at least 7 years ago. And prior to that, I was internal audit. My initial start in the field was really starting with operational audits and then moving into IT audit. From there, I started focusing specifically in the world of PCI and decided at some point in time that internal audit was really maybe not the long-term future that I wanted for myself, because pointing out problems versus helping fix them on the other side of the team was something that was really interesting to me. And so I moved into the information security space about 7 years ago. And kind of as you've read through my resume, I started at Lending Club. So I've done stuff in fintech, e-commerce, software, data analytics, and obviously enterprise or cloud enterprise data management. So that's been my experience thus far.
So in to kind of break the ice, right? Because when people we have a wide range of folks on the stream. Obviously, we have we have everything from nerds to very high level CISOs and CIOs that come to the stream. There's probably some pen testers and some blue teamers who are here at GRC. This is like the lame part of cybersecurity. Like what makes GRC exciting to you, and what was that you were like, I want to be part of that?
Patty's like, those are fighting words. Let's go.
No, you know what? Honestly, it's not, because I always tell people, especially in technology anyway, like building products, people in general don't like information security people because you come in and you tell them that their baby's ugly. Well, being compliant in security is like double telling people your baby's ugly, and here's the rules of like what you need to do to fix that problem, right? So it's always a challenge. I think the things that I really like about it and that drew me into it are, one, the people. Like, I really felt like when I started working in this field, it was like, this is my tribe, you know? And the other thing is that it's every day is different. So every company I've worked at is different. Every relationship that you have to build to kind of do exactly what you're saying, like convince people that there's a value add here, and maybe just compliance is the baseline of what security should be, and that we should be striving for something better, are the reasons that I really enjoy doing it.
So you bring up compliance a lot, and one of the things that I want to kind of jump into almost immediately, right, when it comes to the compliance conversation, really is we have this adage in security that compliance does not equal security. Can you talk about kind of your take on that? What does that mean? What are we doing in the industry to change that mantra?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it is true. I personally don't believe that compliance equals security. You can be compliant, right? But you may not be secure, and everybody knows that. I think what needs to change, or what has been slowly changing, is that compliance, one, can be seen as two things. It is and should be maybe the baseline for what your security program can be built on. It's a really great way to put in place some structure that allows you to sell your product and let people know, hey, we do have some level of like responsibility here in this space. And then the other thing, of course, is that it really allows you to have a conversation with other executives outside of the security space to talk in their language and help them understand, like, these are the baseline things that we need to do. Let's take what we've figured out for building out this program or adding in these controls and level it up so that you can go to the board or you can go to the C-suite and ask for more money to actually build a stronger program. Like, we always need more vulnerability and incident response people. We always need more people on the ground working in architecture, like, and then you always need to figure out, like, how do you put people in other teams to help you have that security mindset across the organization. So that's what I think it has the role to be doing. I think part of the problem becomes a lot of people come in with a very black and white idea of how compliance works. And I don't agree with that at all. I think it totally is not black and white. I think it's crappy that people think that that's the only way that it's going to be accessible and like putting something in place. And you really need to think outside the box in order to, meet the compliance intent, but also like start figuring out how to help your organization have a better security program than that.
And I think that's the problem, right? Is you gave the very textbook answer of why compliance is important, but we all know that you get that like CISO or CIO or even sometimes at the board level where it's like, well, if we're PCI compliant, then we're secure. We don't need to invest anymore in security because we've achieved PCI compliance. Why is that rift so large in that conversation?
Because they speak a different language, right? I mean, they're trying to sell a product. You're trying to secure that product. It's a hard thing to show return on investment in security until there's a problem, right? I mean, and then everybody's like, here's some more money, fix it, figure it out. You got like that 90-day window of here's money. Compliance allows them to at least understand, like, okay, this gets this partner in the door, this gets this sale done, and that's what their focus is, right? First and foremost, you build a company to sell the product. So leveraging your compliance program to talk to the board about getting funding for your security program is really the balance that should be happening. And yes, of course, it is a tool to sell to your customer, but that's what it should be looked at, right? As a tool to sell and a tool to have the CISO then be able to go to the C-suite and say, this is where we're at today, and this is how we're going to get better, and this is what we need to do to get better. While giving them, the things that they care about, which is, yes, of course, they care about being secure on some level, but it's really about getting more customers in the door. I mean, realistically.
You said Jeff's favorite word, ROI.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I had to jump in. Neil, I was actually surprised you started talking. I would have assumed you would have just said, oh, Jeff's going to ask you a couple questions here. No, so first, I got two high-level questions for you right out of the gates. Like, how did you get into security initially? Like, did you say, I just graduated, I want to do this with my life? Or did you kind of take a circuitous route? And then I'll come back to the next question. Sure.
I would say that my route into security in general was the non-standard route. So I think about 50% of people that I've met in the field have similar stories where they didn't start out in technology at all. So I started out in art and specifically in film and video production. So I was using computers, right, and doing editing and those types of things. But very early realized, like, I can't make money and I can't pay my bills, and I'm not, I didn't come from a rich background to like be able to sit around and make movies all day. So I decided I needed to get a job, and one of my first like non-side jobs of like bartending or something was working at a small startup in Florida. And so I started doing some QA work there. It was really small, it was like 13 people. And so eventually that company went under, and I ended up moving out to California. And then I started working different roles here and there, kind of in the project management space, and then eventually moved into internal audit. I was really fortunate that my mentor at that specific company, which was Symantec, realized that my hodgepodge of background gave me a lot of street smarts, and I really read a lot. So I had quite a bit of understanding of the space and how computers worked at that point and everything. Anyway, so that gave me a leg up. And then I started internal audit. And so like I kind of covered it a little bit, but I started in operational audits and I moved over to IT audits. I helped them put together their enterprise risk program, those types of things. And over time, we started realizing that the information security team was doing the PCI audits for the organization, and they wanted to have a little bit more separation of duties between the two teams. So they gave that over to internal audit, to IT audit. And I started running that. And so that really got me involved in like the technical, they say technical, PCI is kind of, more technical than some, but not as much as other frameworks. Understanding of how the frameworks were starting to work, and you could really see the similarities between a lot of them. And so I did that for a while, and then I ended up, a friend of mine was moving over to the fintech space, and he was like, come work for me. And so he's like, but it's not going to be an IT audit. It's going to be, you're jumping to the dark side and you're going to be in cybersecurity. So that's kind of when I started
the dark side.
in the space. Yeah. And
awesome.
Like I said, I really enjoyed it. So that was kind of my starting in the background. Yeah.
Well, and I would argue that most, like Neil, you're a little bit of an anomaly because you went well, for more reasons than one, right? But you went into cyber through the military, and you had an aptitude, capability, and interest, and became a passion, and you just started, and you're staying in that space, right? A lot of us, though, I sold phone systems right out of college. It was like had nothing to do with security or the like, but I'm always interested in how people get into this space, because I would argue that it's probably the majority of us don't have a Neil experience of I was born to be in cyber and I just stayed in there. Oh, come on, you were.
But I love stories like that though, because it continues to resonate that we're always talking about, right? Which is it doesn't matter your background. Like it legitimately doesn't matter your background, and it whether it's now or a few years ago when Patty got in. I mean, the background is pretty much irrelevant. You either force yourself into the career field or you stumble in there, through a job.
Yeah, I would tend to say I agree.
You mentioned something when you were answering about, you just had to jump right in and do some things that you weren't necessarily equipped for, but you did a lot of research. And we talk a lot about, am I good enough to do my job, right? Something that we refer to as imposter syndrome. But right. I'm curious if you struggled with that, how you overcame it. How did you deal with that?
I would say that, yeah, probably a little bit. I mean, especially in the beginning when you are on a team where all the functions are new and you haven't done all of them yourself. And I'm kind of that person that wants to do everything to try and know how it works and figure it out. So yes, in the beginning, I would say just trying to learn the landscape. I understood a lot of it because of the IT audit background and the framework and like the things that you're supposed to have as a baseline, but like how they actually operated on a day-to-day basis, you don't get that information in an audit, right? I mean, like it's so basic, like they're like, here's your policy, here's a bunch of screenshots. Like you can't figure out what people are actually doing. So yeah, I would say in the beginning, and getting over that was really having great conversations with my colleagues and like asking them, so what do you think is the most valuable thing that you do every day? And similar question, how did you get involved in this? And why do you decide to stay in one specific area of the function, versus why don't you want to be a CISO, or why don't you want to go into operations, or, those types of things. And then, asking people what keeps them up at night and like, how can I help you figure that out? And like really trying to find my space in their world, trying to help them out too. Is I think probably a lot of what I did was really fact finding, research, making friends, and shaking hands and kissing babies. So yeah.
Real quick, Patty. It looks like we've got a question coming in from one of our guests, and as a reminder, everybody, go ahead and drop your questions in chat, and I do promise a model grab them and start pushing them up as it's relevant. Back to your conversation about compliance earlier, and this is that slingshot that I told you we do occasionally across the stream. Shouldn't compliance be our friend in trying to get funding for InfoSec in a corporation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you're having a different experience than that, then I think there's a problem, right? I mean, my whole belief system really is that compliance should be helping the CISO figure out how to frame the problems for the organization in a way that gets them funding. So yes, if you, like I said, if you have the different relationship with your compliance team, I'm sorry. And it's like, but a lot of people have that background where they really feel like things are very black and white. Yeah. And you really need a partner on that team that's going to say, this is a gray area. Let's figure out how we can like fake it till we make it. And to, like those types of things first and foremost. And also trying to figure out like the requirement says maybe is not what you're exactly doing, but how do you frame it in a way that gets you to the next level so that you can go to your leadership and say, you know what, here's where the gap is, and this is what we're going to need to do it. And like, obviously figuring out what the story is around your return on investment. That's what they should be doing. They should be helping out, whether it's through your risk program or not. Like,
I think the disconnect that I see, and I don't know if you see this as well in your dealings, right, is compliance was put in place to try to help facilitate that conversation between the CISO and the C-suite. But then the CISO comes through and says, SOC director or director of architecture or some other operational role. Hey, look, are we PCI compliant, or are we doing penetration tests? Are we doing vulnerability scanning? To meet this compliance requirement? And the gap between answering that question and these highly technical roles where they take a question like that and say, well, we're not scanning this system, or this system hasn't been patched in 45 days, or, sure, we're doing penetration testing, but we're only doing on these systems over here. They almost self-destruct themselves in trying to help facilitate that conversation with a CISO, and ultimately end up doing more damage than good in trying to help the CISO fight that argument when they're trying to play that role. Is that what you see as well?
I would say yes, but I also say, do you think it's because they're trying to manage the scope because they don't have the manpower to turn around and like fix all those problems if the scope expands, right? I mean, so if you're pen testing everything, you're going to find a million problems, right? Like, so then if you don't have the team to fix them, then you have the stack of technical debt. Sure, you can put it on the risk register, but then you don't know what you're not protecting at that point, right? I mean, it just opens up a huge can of worms. So I could caveat the argument that yes, they need to be more transparent, but potentially understanding that maybe where they're coming from is that they don't want the scope to expand because they can't fix the problems that they're going to find. I
think that's a fair point. And I got all goosebumpy when you said risk register.
Sorry, is that a trigger?
I had a CISO tell me one time that the pen test I did against a computer that ultimately led me to get into the PCI environment told me that I needed to take that off the pen test report because it was below the risk register and therefore was not a valid attack vector.
What? So that's okay.
So yeah, risk register is a little bit of a sticking point there. Back on the compliance.
I don't even understand that logic.
I know.
Yeah, okay.
I know. Yeah. Back on the compliance thing, I want to dive into the compliance stuff because we've seen privacy compliance change a lot over the last few years. GDPR, the data privacy rules in the EU, California privacy law in California. We know that there are other states that are looking to expand on that. And I think that my opinion on it, and Jeff, feel free to chime in with your opinion on it as well, right? I think that we all had high hopes for, especially GDPR with their 15% penalty, that would actually start to bring a lot more emphasis on the importance of cybersecurity. But then we see British Airways, Marriott, and other organizations really try to skirt around having to pay those 15% fines, and it waters down to nothing more than a slap on the wrist. How has GDPR changed your role in GRC, and did you have kind of that same slap in the face when it didn't hit as hard as you wanted it to?
Well, I think even as much as like 3 years ago, GDPR was like the huge buzzword, and everybody was trying to get it started before the legislation became active. I don't think a lot of companies were prepared for the overhead. The same with CCPA, right? I mean, like they have all these nuanced requirements. You need 100,000 clients. You need, to have this button on your web page, like all this crap. Like, I don't think that companies were prepared for the actual execution of the number of requirements and the controls. But I also think a lot of it was legal jargon, right? I mean, and so they're having a huge amount of problems trying to actually like hold the feet to the fire because a lot of it isn't really, there's no precedent. So of course in law, there's always like, what's the precedent? Like, how are we going to handle this? and just trying to figure out what that precedent really can be at this point in time. I think they're having a hard time trying to figure it out. It has really been watered down because of all the recent breaches where you have massive amounts of data that's been, lost, and then trying to figure out. I think what the problem comes down to is that it's really easy to go back and just like with a compliance framework and say, well, this was the control that we had in place and it meets the intent of what you've written down. So how are they going to then turn around and say, well, we still want to fine you 15%, right? They have to have the argument there that essentially is saying, we have the controls in place. We did what you told us to do. And the controls that they've been expressing, whether it's through 27701 for ISO now, and just basically translating them directly to controls in general. I think HITRUST is coming out with something as well, but having those in place doesn't make the organization more secure, right? I mean, this is a continuous conversation that we're going to be having no matter what. Yeah. And so the regulation had 99 different articles that you were supposed to look through and determine how to execute on them. But a lot of it was really, part of it was really on paper. Like, this is how we're going to tell our customers that we're doing things versus like actually doing the second step, which is like securing things in a way that makes it more secure, right? So I don't know. I do think that it's really more about the fact that they can say to the letter of the article that they did what they were supposed to do, and that's how they're getting around it.
Do you think that, I mean, we know that other countries, and China's hot on the heels. We know Russia was hot on the heels. I think Brazil's hot on the heels. We know other countries, and especially other states here in the U.S., are really starting to look at that as well. Do you think that we're, now that ball is rolling, are we moving towards disaster with more countries going that way and no understanding of what those impacts are to an organization?
Well, I think you could look at it the other way. Is the organization prepared for, the most stringent letter of regulation to come out that's really going to impede the way they operate, right? And then what does that really mean is that they need to have the people on board in our world, right, whether it's security or privacy or legal, that understand what the implications are when they choose not to implement the requirements. Because it's no different than any other international law. I mean, you have to follow them. If you want to pay, you got to pay to play. So I don't think...
Neil and I talked about this a fair amount just with the state regulations, right? And at some point, is our federal government going to step in and say, you've got New York, you've got California, you've got all of these different states with various requirements. Wouldn't it make more sense for them to say, time out, we're not going to have a state-by-state rule because everyone is virtual now, for crying out loud. You're not having people in one state. Wouldn't it make more sense to just have one? What are your thoughts on that?
She cannot wait to tell you no on this one.
I know. I could see it. You're like, no more regulations, please.
Well, I don't even think that that's the problem, right? I just don't see there being a feasible way for the way that our government operates today to write something that would be all-encompassing in a way that they wouldn't see it being intrusive of the individual rights and the rights of the organization. So I think it's still going to be on a state-by-state basis for at least maybe the next 10 to 20 years. I'd be very surprised if it changes sooner.
Does that make it harder for organizations? This is a two-part question. Does that make it harder for organizations, and I'm going to leave that general, when there's 51, even from a state perspective, different regulations that they may have to contend with, let alone the international ones?
Yeah, why not? I mean, of course it's going to make it harder. I think you have to, in order to execute it, you have to go with the most stringent, right?
So then my follow-on to that is, how do SMBs and mid-caps, folks who are already struggling to have, we've got people in chat right now who are the sole IT and cybersecurity person, right? How are those companies supposed to continue to function when there's more regulation that they already don't have budget for, don't have people for, don't have an understanding of, but are still going to face the same penalties for?
Yeah, I mean, my husband's the sole IT security person at his company too, so we have this conversation at home, right? I think the starting point is figuring out what framework is going to try and meet the intent, like sitting down with your legal person, maybe there's one, maybe it's outsourced, whatever, and saying, this is how we think we're going to manage it. Mm-hmm. And is this going to be sufficient, right? And then you still have to have a plan. Like if somebody, I mean, California, CCPA, for example, says you have the ability and the right to download your data and who's accessed it for 24 months, right? So, I mean, you have to have a way to functionally figure out what does that actually mean. And maybe that means you have an MSP help you figure it out, like, honestly. And if you don't have the budget for that, then it is really like putting in baseline controls, whether that's CIS 20 or something to say, okay, at least we're doing this much, right? So we have some kind of level of CYA at this point. Yeah.
Is, I guess I think that's part of the doom and gloom that I see with more of these industry regulations that we get, because I still think that there's no hope for some of these companies when that happens. And I think that that's a good way to also kind of segue into third-party risk, right? Because you've got bigger companies, it doesn't matter what Fortune number are on there, who are going to talk to these smaller companies and say, show me this program, show me that program, show me this program. And they're barely getting by with the one IT person, running their company, let alone building 51 different privacy programs. How has third-party risk made business harder from a cybersecurity perspective?
Well, I would tend to say first, there's a couple things. It could be because it's being required contractually, right? So you have this contractual obligation that you're putting together for your third parties. Additionally, on the other side, you are protecting your organization by doing that, right? Here's the security addendum. Can you make sure you do these 10 things? Especially when you're hiring like 2 guys in a garage or whatever to like help with some part of your functioning of your product or whatever it's going to be. And then I think the other thing that makes third-party risk a challenge is that there is it's a couple things, right? So I mean,
get the box out, get ready to stand on it.
So one being, there's a lot of pressure, small SMB, let's just talk about that's the space, and it doesn't matter like if you have 100 customers or not, they have an expectation that you're managing their data in a secure way, irrespective of you are a one-person shop or not. And there's a lot of companies that come in and say they expect you to have this baseline level of security in place. You can't necessarily do that without help. So it really comes down to executing on a framework. But the difference is that when they come back and check in a year, a lot of places have these audit clauses that say we're going to check up on you, and you don't have a SOC 2 or you haven't done your ISO certification, you may end up losing that business. I think that the framework really pushes companies that are smaller to look at getting stuff like their SOC 2 right away, even if it's like a fake SOC 2,
Get a SOC 2 off the black market, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But, I've seen some surprising things happen with people that have SOC 2s, and it's very
right now Neil's building a business plan. I can actually market fake SOC 2s.
I was like, I can create them. Can I sell under market SOC 2s? This ought to be a good one right here.
Well, it's just, there's a lot of pressure for companies to put in place things that they can't fully execute. And I think that that's the biggest burden, right? Is you have these small companies, you don't have the budget. Maybe you don't even have an IT person. You have everything outsourced to an MSP for 5 hours a day or something and so doing those types of things only gives a certain level of comfort. And then you have to figure out what is next to make sure that you are minimizing your liability. Mm-hmm. So that's really what it comes down to. Now, whether or not putting in getting a SOC 2 report minimizes your liability is not for me to say, but I would tend to say that, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so, but I do think that essentially doing those types of things put an undue burden on a very small company out of the gate, and just trying to get your customers to be happy. And I understand like why you do it, but I also understand like people forget after you've done that, now you have like 25 controls that you have to continuously execute on and then prove it the next year. And when you don't have the manpower to do that, or you don't have the systems in place, you're really backing yourself into a corner when you have to go back and explain why you didn't pass.
I want to pick on TPRM a little bit and see if you agree or disagree with this. And I was having this conversation in full transparency. Gerald Auger was on my stream a couple weeks ago, and we kind of got into this. And put yourself in the position of literally any Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, company that's out there who has a well-matured TPRM program, and you're asking your suppliers all the time, for their SOC 2 compliance, for, hey, do you do pen tests? Hey, let us know in 48 hours, 24 hours if you got a breach or things like that. And they're putting tons of pressure on these SMBs and mid-cap companies that are their suppliers to do that. But then they also know that they're buying services from like Amazon, right? Or Azure, right? And there's no way that Azure or Amazon is going to say, hey, look, we had a breach 24 hours ago. Here's your notice as part of our TPRM contract. Isn't that a catch-22 and puts a really bad precedence out there that we're going to enforce it downstream, but we know that we're never going to get it from some of these upstream companies?
It is. And I think part of the problem there kind of goes back to the original conversation, which is it's all required in legislation. And so when you don't have the firepower legally to go in and say, well, we didn't declare it a breach yet, so we are not going to tell anybody, you have to figure out what the right thing to do is at that point, right? And like when you're a tiny company, you decide that you need to be probably more transparent up front because you don't have the ability to fight back the same way. Yeah. I think it sucks, but yes, it's definitely true.
At least we can admit that it sucks. I think that, yeah, and I think that was the point that I was trying to make, right? Is that and I think you brought up the point very eloquently, right? Is that it does put an undue amount of stress onto some of these SMBs and mid caps. And I think you brought up a really good point, right? You're going to put in 25 controls, and then that one person who rushed in 48 to 72 hours to put in 25 controls at the last minute now has to try to go and maintain those 72 controls for the next 12 months or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. And that's a huge problem too. I think people forget, like, getting that doesn't mean it's the end of it. It means it's the beginning of a whole bunch more stuff. So you have to be willing to take it all on.
Yeah.
So with the recent meat packing hack, right? The government got involved and they were like, hey, was your first call to lawyers to make sure that it couldn't be discoverable? Like, that to me is like the biggest no-brainer thing to do. And it sounds a little like underhanded, but I don't know any company that would, within their brain power, say, hey, let's not do that. We're going to just be open with everything that just went on. Would any company realistically not just call their lawyer first thing?
Not that I can think of, but probably it's happened.
There's there's zero reason to do anything else, right?
Well, the senator was asking, I forget who it was, but you're like, yeah, duh. Of course, that's what we were doing.
Yeah, I mean, right away, you're like getting your huddle room together and like trying to figure out what the heck to do next. So, of course, they're going to be in the room, you would think. I don't know. Yeah,
could you think
if you didn't call your lawyer first, that would be bigger problems.
That's what I was going to say. Is from a risk perspective, could you think of any scenario where if I'm a SOC director, I come to you in the CISO and I'm like, hey, we just lost 100,000 records of PCI data or a million records of HIPAA data, and you're like, don't call the lawyers, just go straight to director of PR, the PR director, and put that out on the public. Could you think of a scenario at all where that happens?
April Fool's Day? No, I have no idea. Like,
so are we lying to ourselves whenever we rail on companies like JBS who are not being transparent because we don't understand that they're waiting for their lawyers to say, okay, now you can tell somebody about this breach?
Well, I think railing on them is fine anyway, but I mean,
I knew she was going to be I knew she was going to be a great guest. Rail on him anyway.
Absolutely. That's a totally different question.
But yes, I mean, realistically, I think that is probably your first step in any kind of situation where you feel like you're going to end up in hot water, I would think, you know? Yeah.
Do lawyers add an unnecessary level of abstraction in that breach response process?
They can. I mean, I think it depends, you know, how granular things get and like what the actual problem comes down to. So yes, of course they can come in and say, well, specifically, we're talking about the scope of blah, blah, blah. This is going to be considered out of scope. You know what I mean? Like it can get really particular very quickly so that they can figure out how to minimize potentially the damage or understand like what the landscape looks like at that point. So yeah, it can be painful.
So I'm going to piggyback on that one to say, what about cyber insurance?
Yes. What about cyber insurance?
Look at that. We even got the sigh in on that one. It was like,
you know, there are 3 different soapboxes on this one. Just depends on which one you want to go down.
Does cyber insurance add an unnecessary layer of abstraction to breaches?
Yes, definitely. I would tend to say that it does. But, you know, I was talking about this with somebody, a friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about, I think that a lot of it comes down to the language that's in your contract now. And I think that really became more nuanced after probably the one that I can think of the most was the Target breach when, you know, cyber insurance started really, first of all, getting popular, but also it started getting really specific. So it's kind of just like your homeowner's insurance now or whatever. They're specifically like negating, like, oh, if you have a natural disaster, well, it's kind of the same thing in cyber insurance now. Like, oh, well, if you have this specific type of breach, you're not covered. If you have this specific type of thing, you're not covered. It's the same thing. So it makes it really painful, and it's not a transparent process for companies, especially smaller ones, to figure out when they're in the middle of the problem, like what are they actually going to cover and what are they going to help me figure out, right? I mean, so essentially the insurance policies that I've seen essentially just cover like maybe like cleanup and then like after action. And maybe, you know, if you're losing records, maybe they're helping fund like the Experian membership for the year or something like that too. But it definitely adds a layer of complication that doesn't necessarily have to be there because of the lack of understanding, I think, on the policy holder's side about what it should specifically cover. And so like when you have those conversations, you need to really ask them, is it going to cover ransomware? Is it going to cover this specific thing that happens? Is it going to cover insider threat? Like those types of things before you decide to just sign on the dotted line. I feel like everybody feels like they need to have it, but I think you really need to know what it's going to cover.
I think that's a fantastic point. I do want to come back to that. Do you feel like CISOs, and I'm definitely asking you to generalize across the industry, knowing, you know, that you know that may not be a fair question to you, but that's okay. I asked Jeff unfair questions all the time. I asked Jeff, do you think CISOs have generally viewed, or maybe it's not CISOs, maybe it's board of directors, have viewed cyber insurance as risk deferrence?
Yes, I don't know if it's CISOs. I don't know that. I think if you're running a program, then you're probably a little more realistic about what that actually is going to entail and cover. But I think, you know, when you're talking about risk tolerance of the organization, I do think that they think that really mitigates a lot of the risk because they have the insurance, right? So I think that would be something that is a bigger conversation to have at the executive level and just say, you know, this is only going to cover like $7 a record. And so how are we going to mitigate the rest of it? And here's like the loss curve. And this is what we think it would actually project to be costs. So
we're going to come back to the cyber insurance question. We do have a priority question. We do allow our viewers to submit points to do a priority question. And it looks like 3K64 Serenity's got a priority question. It says, how would you help someone figure out if GRC would be a right fit for them? Probably talking about from a career perspective.
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the big things to do is maybe try to find somebody in the community. At least in my experience, people are really willing to help and mentor. If you have an interest in reading a lot, I would say maybe you like GRC. If you have an interest in understanding legislation and the execution of it at the actual business layer. Maybe you would like to be a GRC, like you like writing policies, but not policies on policies. Then maybe
Come on, Patty, don't oversell it. Don't oversell it here.
No, but I mean,
if you enjoy reading 350 pages of legal jargon and legislation, this is the job for you.
No, it can be analytical, so somebody might like that stuff.
So in all fairness, Patty, we had Joel Fulton, who is the former CISO of Splunk, come on the stream.
I know Joel.
Okay, good. You know Joel. Oh, that's right. Yeah. You know Joel. He did equate that GRC was a garbage job. And so
everybody says that. Yeah.
Everybody says that. So like that's where Jeff's coming from with this. Is you're talking about like if you enjoy writing policies, this job's for you.
I know. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people do say that. And like I said at the beginning, people, especially in technology, in my experience, people are like, oh, here comes security team to tell me my baby's ugly. Well, then they come in, here's security compliance, they hate you even more, right? So, it is a job specifically that I would say talk to people in the field about if you're really interested in. A lot of people are have different experiences than what I've had, right? So, I mean, I'm always happy to tell people, like, this is what happens here. This is how you deal with disgruntled coworkers. This is how you deal with, executive layer conversations, those types of things. But I think the positive impact that you can have across the organization with helping them at least get to the baseline for security is rewarding. And yes, I know a lot of people on the security side, especially on the pen testing side and those types of things, are like, I hate your job and I never want to do it. Seriously, I've had people say that to me, so
But that's why I enjoy bringing this topic up, though, because I think that's important, right? And we do have we probably have some people like that in chat. I know that I know we've got at least one guy. If he were here, I'd definitely call him out, but I don't see him in chat right now, so I'd call him out on this one. But they're like, I never want to deal with GRC, whatsoever. I never want to believe in that organization. What is the correlation, right? Why, if you were talking to a pen tester right now, or if you were talking to an incident responder right now, or you're talking to a threat hunter right now, what would you say to them is the things that they need to care about your job?
I would say that you should always be looking to leverage your GRC person to try and get things accomplished in your organization, because you pushing back and saying this isn't working or this is broken or this is a problem, you might end up with a pile of technical debt, right? I mean, like, it's not going to get pushed through. But leverage your GRC person and say, hey, can we push the fact that we need to maintain this for some certification or contractual obligations or regulatory obligations? Leverage that person to help you write your problem statement and your solution that you're going to present to the business and say, and this is why it needs to happen, because they have a lot of ability to negate some of the pushback when you're trying to get your job done.
Is when we talk about things like, and one of the things that I think that there's a huge gap on in that conversation, right, between risk and operations, really comes down to understanding the weird terms that risk uses, things like risk register, things like risk tolerance, things like risk acceptance, things like risk exceptions. Right. Can you kind of walk through some of those common GRC terms and what those mean, not just to you on the GRC side, but what they should mean to somebody on the operations side?
Sure. So, I mean, if we want to start with the confusing terms of risk exception and risk acceptance, so asking for an exception in general would be like, we know that this particular feature isn't meeting the intent of our let's say access policy or something. And so you're going in and saying, but we do have a compensating control, which is probably another thing I'll explain in a second, in place. And this is how we're meeting the intent. You may need to still go ask for an exception during the time period where you think that you won't be able to meet the intent of the initial requirement, right? And usually it's at the policy layer, like, oh, we're not doing these things and we're not meeting the intent of the company policy. So unfortunately, they kind of all piggyback on each other. But essentially what you're doing is when you're asking for an exception, then someone has to accept it. Usually we go to like the VP layer to say, do you agree that this is sufficient and you have a roadmap to fix it or close it out, or however you're going to open tickets for and monitor. And then the answer is coming from the company level risk tolerance, right? I mean, so risk tolerance then is, do we think that if there was an issue because we didn't have this in place, can we sufficiently recover from it, and would it be considered material, right? So that's your tolerance level, is like, is this material to our organization? No or yes. And if it isn't, then of course you're going to accept the risk, right? I mean, and if it could be considered
real quick, because you use the word material. When we talk material, that's a fiscal term that like the controller, the CFO, they're looking for to understand. Do they have to report this on their 10K? Do they have to make it public? Things like that, right?
Correct. Yes. And does it have a financial impact to the organization, either because of reputational or financial damage, or et cetera? I mean, so you want to look at those types of things at the executive level when you're going for a risk exception and asking for an acceptance. Acceptance generally means that you're accepting it forever. An exception means it's accepted for a period of time, right? And then we'll go back and talk about it again in a year or something like that. And then when we're talking about compensating controls, those are the controls you have in place that say, this is parity to what you're asking. And I personally like using compensating controls a lot, because I think a lot of the frameworks have been written like 15 years ago and they don't even apply to the way the world works now. So like, you have to have a really good argument for your compensating controls a lot of time when it comes to talking to your auditors. But you essentially, it's saying that you have parity to what they're asking for, and that you can actually execute on it and still have the same amount of security in place. So those are, I think, did I cover all your terms except for risk register?
I think so too. I want to talk really quick about risk acceptance, risk tolerance, and things like that, because I did kind of set you up for that one. I know that there's, again, we get back to kind of that difference between that operational role and that risk management role. There are times where the operations comes through and says, hey, this is a problem. And the risk team and the organization say, we have accepted that risk. We are okay with that risk being here. And I know that it drives a lot of technical people and operational people crazy when that happens.
So I would try to think about like a way that if it was me and you guys are coming to me and saying this is a problem, then it needs to be reevaluated. And then your tolerance isn't what you think it is, right? I mean, like if you're ignoring what they're saying and they're saying that it's a problem because it was accepted, even if it was accepted last week, you should still reevaluate it and listen to what everybody has to say about why it needs to be a priority. I mean, that's what I would do anyway.
Just keep reassessing that risk and just seeing, coming to an agreement as to what that risk really is.
Right. And if there's some kind of, long-term plan to mitigate it or figure out, how to fix the problem, that's really what needs to happen.
What about in terms of and we talk back on the risk acceptance, risk exception type side of things, right? One of the big problems that I've seen is organizations allow risks to be accepted at the wrong level, oftentimes way lower down in the organization, especially with somebody who doesn't have fiscal, responsibilities for the organization. Is that still a majority problem when it comes to most organizations as well?
I would say at the organizations I've been at, no, right? I mean, like it really does get bubbled up to the right layer. It does get tracked. It does get reported on, maybe not to the board level, but maybe to the executive level on an ongoing basis so that what you're accepting or exceptions are. And then if there's trends, right? Like, we continue to have trends where we're asking for an exception for all these different types of things. What are we really not fixing here, right? Like, what's the actual problem? Because we shouldn't have 20 access exceptions, right? Something like that. I would think that you would look at that as well.
So do you end up going through and evaluating like once a year, once a quarter, whatever, all of those exceptions and say, hey, is there a better way to handle this on a global basis? And do you end up working with your IT partners at that point to come up with projects that would do that?
Ideally, yes. Whether it means that you're then looking at the 2022 plan for next year to figure out like how you're going to mitigate these risks or if it's a priority. But yeah, you should be at least evaluating your risk register and things that you're tracking at least on a quarterly basis. And if you don't have the bandwidth to do that, then you should have them at least be bubbled up, because usually they're at a granular layer where it's like control level risks or, very technical specific things in the products that you're working with that need to be mitigated at some point. But you should at least then roll them up so that you're reporting it at the executive level to determine how planning makes sense to fix the problems and or changing risk tolerance. Yeah.
But and you were talking earlier about return on investment and even writing the business case for pushing a project up and getting it approved. Question: First of all, how often does that actually happen? Like, how often do people come to you and say, I want to have a half hour on your calendar to walk through this problem that I see and how that could apply to GRC in order to get funding and approval and sponsorship and support? And then tagged on to that is, how do you put a dollar figure against some of these risks that the company is maybe going to sign on to really put teeth into that report? Sure.
So the first part of the question, I would say it doesn't happen as often as it should, but it does happen. It really depends on the size of the company, right? I mean, if it's a really small company and you're just trying to implement a program, you're probably not going to have that relationship across product or engineering or AppSec or any of those types of things, right? But when the companies get bigger, medium size, I would say even like where I'm on a security team of maybe at least 10 plus people, you do start to see those relationships form. And I've had some really good interactions with like product security, application security, operations, and building those programs and building that use case to go forward and ask for more funding. And, you know, the good thing about being in the security organization, depending on how your organization's structured, is when you would hope that when the CISO asks for money, even if it's not the amount that you're going to get, right? Like you're not going to get it all. The fact that you have the ask out there, and if they said no, I mean, that means that they're accepting the risk of what you're trying to point out and fix, right? So you have your back covered, and hopefully, you know, that means something too.
Yeah. Question for both of you, actually, related to that. Is it the responsibility of the security operations team or GRC to go and build those bridges?
To the other business units?
Yeah, well, to each other. Like,
who's
supposed to reach out first?
I always end up reaching out. Like, I don't really mind. But I think I would tend to say, I think it depends on the team and the culture of the team, right? And like how that usually is grown. I don't know. Neil, do you have an opinion?
I would actually say a good ops team. Like if I were coming into an organization fresh, right? Especially with an organization that already had a GRC team or something like that would be one of my very first phone calls that I would make and I would be asking questions like, what's our risk tolerance? What's our risk register? What's our cyber insurance policy? Give me all of the policies, you know, that you've created, right? I'd want to know. I want to know where the crown jewels are. I want to know where all that stuff is, because like if I'm going to protect it, if I'm going to pen test it, if I'm going to threat hunt against it, right? All those operational type things. I think that it's you know, yes, ultimately I think we'd all like to be yes, both of us, we come together and sing Kumbaya and do it together. But if I walk into an organization, like I think a good ops director is calling you up and being like, we're best friends for at least 2 weeks while we figure this out.
I would agree. So I mean,
do either of you see any of your peers who would not be willing to have that conversation or eager to have that conversation, might be a better term?
I think it depends on the team, honestly.
Yeah. I have no shame saying I know several people in the ops world who, you know, could care less about calling their GRC person up. Like I think we have a problem in the ops world. Like I 100% think we have a problem in the ops world.
But do you think the problem is because they don't, like, what do you think the problem is? Realistically, do you think it's because they don't feel like the GRC side understands what the work is? Or do you think it's because they don't think they're technical enough? Or do you think it's because they just see it as extra work? I don't know. I mean,
I think it's all of that, and they don't understand the value that understanding that knowledge does to add ROI to their role. I think in the ops world, my thought on this, and I'd love to have both of you guys' opinion on this as well, is I think in the ops world, we're fire people, right? And we're finding problems. Like we're firemen, we're fighting fires, especially on the IR side. We're looking for problems on the pen test and vulnerability management side. We're looking for bad guys on the threat hunting side. And so our focus is on do right now. And we rarely take the time to take a step back and say, but if I'm pen testing over here, is it the right place to pen test? So what? I've got a Windows XP box over here. Maybe the organization has accepted that risk. Maybe it's protecting something that's below the risk register. I think that there's a misunderstanding on the ops side how to utilize that to show a better return on investment in what it is that they do.
That probably is definitely true. I mean, but I think that that's across the board, right? I mean, I think the where I've seen GRC teams be leveraged the most is usually with AppSec, right? Your product or AppSec teams when they're going in and they're trying to nail down like requirements and technical debt and get things solved in the product that you're selling. I think that that's where you see that relationship probably being leveraged more. And I agree with you on the ops side. It's less about how we can use this team to like better our program and get what we need accomplished by probably going through and doing like more risk reviews and those types of things, and then quantifying it so you can show the return on investment. It's really hard, right, to show ROI in general, which is your other question. In security, I mean, we talk about, you could go in and talk about the FAIR model, and we can talk about like loss amounts that would be taken from like general internal and external quantifications of assets and what's happening in the world, and like how you add all of those together to determine what yours potentially might be a range of. But essentially, I think at the end of the day, we are not being utilized in a way that could help those teams operate more efficiently. So yeah, and then using that to show ROI out of the gate versus waiting until you have a breach. Because that's usually when people are like, oh, this costs $17 million and now we need to give you guys 20. Here's $20 million to like fix the problem, and it's a little bit late. So
I think that's always at least that's always been my struggle when I've looked at the ops side on GRC is you start to put numbers to value and you realize that like, pen testing certain assets, that asset really doesn't have a huge cost to the enterprise. And I find that there's a lot of denial from pen testers and red teamers because they want to think that Jeff and I gave a purple team lesson a couple weeks ago. And we talked about how the CISO and the CEO and the board, they don't care about your exploit. They just care about the ROI and the finances part of it. And I think that that's a really hard conversation for a lot of red teamers and pen testers to realize that Windows XP machine that you love to exploit, that you literally can't do anything with, has zero value to the organization whatsoever. And sure, maybe it just needs to be turned off. And that's probably a fair statement. But it's not worth escalating all the way up to the board of directors because it falls below the risk line.
Well, I don't know. I think that, this falls below the risk line. I think it's kind of crappy. But I think, in order to make everybody happy in that situation, just put it on the risk register as low, right? I mean, like, and then it's there, it's documented. So if there is a problem, you can point and say, see, you guys mislabeled it and it's messed up. So,
yeah. So I saw you react pretty negatively to below the risk registry, right? So you want pretty much everything on the registry and just like categorized as a level 1 or lowest, whatever.
I think in that case, when you see consistent like irritation about something like this, then yes, why not put it on there, right? I don't think you can realistically capture everything in the world and like put it on there. I don't think anybody has that ability, but I think when it comes to your bigger rocks and things like that are important to the teams that you work with, you want to make sure that they're put on there. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask mods to. We're coming up on 15 after the hour, and I know that I've got told in my ear that we've got quite a few questions sitting in queue. So I'm gonna ask them to start pushing questions up, Patty. This is a great opportunity for anybody who's listening to. If you haven't already got your questions in, go ahead and drop your questions in. We're gonna try to give a little bit more time to Patty to answer some questions. These are gonna come at you pretty fast, Patty. They're gonna be all over the board. we'll ask them to start coming through here a little bit. What's the most difficult segment in GRC you deal with on a regular basis?
I think a lot of people don't understand what governance is. But I think that's one component. I think that people think that governance is just updating the policy and doing security training, but it really is a lot more than that. And it really is, I would say governance and awareness in the organization. So when we're not talking to security people and you're trying to explain how to keep the organization safe, it's a totally different language that you have to explain and learn and figure out how to communicate to your constituents in the organization. And I think that's the biggest challenge is like most of the people you deal with are not in the space. They don't know what the heck you're talking about. And they don't understand that critical thinking when you're opening an email and clicking on a link needs to happen until after the fact. So I think that that's probably one of the biggest challenges. It's not just policies and it's not just the annual phishing contest. It really is a lot more than that as far as like governing security across the organization and like trying to explain the value for people.
Just because I saw BSEC say it in chat, he was unaware. It seems that the security awareness was a GRC type function. Is that pretty much what you've seen as well? Is that usually security awareness and that annual phishing stuff that typically falls under GRC?
I think it depends on how it's set up in different organizations. Like I've run phishing awareness campaigns, security awareness. I've run privacy, risk management, governance, sales enablement, third-party risk, business continuity. I think it depends. Like the bubble can be as big or as small as the organization thinks it should be. Yeah.
That was one from Claw Overdraw. I'll ask there we go. The next one. From Fasochi Actual, question, does audit require hands-on skills / training, or is it more soft skills and networking?
There is some level of hands-on skills that you would need to have. You need to understand how the frameworks work. You need to have how to understand how to write a work paper. You need to understand how to like put together an actual audit paper, audit program, reporting, quarterly reporting, those types of things in order to figure out how to actually become an auditor. So there is like steps to get there if that's something that you're interested in. And the first thing I would say is probably look at what the audit lifecycle says, and then that kind of gives you an understanding of the basics of that framework.
Is there inherently any technical roles when I look at this question and I think about it? I think there's kind of like some undertones here. Are there inherently any technical roles in the GRC organization typically, or are there, or is it pretty much all non-technical roles in GRC?
I think it's changing. I think maybe it used to not be entirely technical, but I think over time, when you look at what people are trying to hire for, it's kind of like a product manager, right? You have to have some understanding of how computers work and how networking works and how architecture works and secure frameworks and what you're trying to execute. So yeah, I think it is changing, but I think it's not. You also have to have soft skills and networking capabilities because you're asking people to do one more thing in their day, and it's seen as a pain in the butt. So.
That is an understatement of the year right there. It's seen as a pain in the butt.
I know. I mean, I do it every day. I know how people.
But I say that in the most respectful way because it is. There's a lot to GRC, and I think you hit the nail on the head that people don't fully understand like all that's involved and everything that is that you all do. White Cyberduck says, "Hey Patty, what are some interesting opportunities and challenges working for a huge company like Google?" If you can answer this one, if you can't, then that's fine. But feel free to jump in there.
I would say not specific to Google, but in general, larger companies have different problems, and they have the way that they are set up usually is segmented more. So you really have to figure out who's responsible for what to try and get your job done. So I think those are some of the interesting things that you find out when you get bigger and bigger companies. Specifics get broken down into smaller and smaller things so that you can, try to figure out what your day job looks like. It's kind of difficult. That would be the biggest thing that I find.
Probably also like if you've got an organization with like a lot of dispersed business units and things like that, and making relationships inside of each of those individual business units.
Definitely. And never finding the right person to actually help you. It's like another thing.
or for somebody who will give you the time of the day to at least try to hear your quandary so that you can get to the right person.
Exactly. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Tanwa says, based on your experience, how often does compliance standards and procedures change based on feedback from those who are implementing? What does that change management look like for a larger organization?
So the standards are usually written by, a governing body outside of the organization. Usually, in my experience, changes to frameworks happen every 4 to 8 years. And you can usually be on some kind of committee to help provide guidance about how things are written or executed or requirements that are being put into those frameworks. So it's usually outside of the organization. And then when you're in an organization, for example, a good example right now is that PCI DSS4 is coming out. So a lot of companies that are executing on PCI DSS3, you would start looking for the new framework to come out. And then usually they give you a window of time to start changing over to executing on that. But change management would be like trying to figure out what you're mapping your controls to your old controls. Hopefully they've already done that for you, but maybe they haven't. And then trying to figure out what you're doing that will meet the intent of what the changes are. That's usually about it. I think it's pretty straightforward.
What about kind of that chicken and an egg problem that happens at some organizations? Like you mentioned standards being written by an outside organization. I've been part of some organizations where there wasn't an encryption standard that was publicly available that we wanted to adopt, and so we had to write our own standard internally. But then there's always that and I'm glad you got the put your IT audit hat on this one, right? Where you put a standard in place, but that literally the very next day or the next week, IT audit could come down and see if you're adhering to that standard. Are there kind of just even gentlemen's handshakes in most organizations that say, look, if I release a standard today, you probably don't have to adhere to it for 6 months to a year or something like that?
Yeah, I would say that definitely if you're releasing an internal standard and you're trying to get it adopted, you should probably, if it was me, you have at least a 6-month window. And it really depends on how technically challenging it is to implement, right? I mean, if you're going to be implementing SSO and now that's part of your access standard, that's a longer roadmap potentially, depending on how much, your landscape is in your organization. So yeah, I would say you would want to say, this is what we're doing. This is what we can point to for our evidence for future state. And this is the roadmap for getting there. But no, you wouldn't. It would be unrealistic to expect it to be happening tomorrow, right?
That's been the biggest challenge that I've seen is like the IT team starts freaking out and thinking that they have to adhere to a standard tomorrow.
But that's the very black and white thinking, right? I mean, like realistically, you should be really thinking like this is a gray area and how to partner with the business versus coming in tomorrow and being like, all right, now I'm going to check and see if you did your thing. Like, give me a break.
So you could change one thing within IT ops in the business. What would it be? Like, what would be one thing that would really make a material difference?
I think the way that access is managed at most organizations is too manual. So I think like removing that burden in a way that automates a lot of that and like inherently builds role-based access, and then there is exceptions to the rule, but you have the rule, is a much better way to go. And a lot of places try to do that, but they don't really get it over the line because there's always like subsystems out there that are still being managed on a one-off basis. So that's probably the thing that stands out to me.
Devnal Zen comes through and says, are there any parts of compliance that bleed over into HR regarding headcount, employee backgrounds, experiences, etc.?
Yeah, almost every single framework has a HR security check requirements. So yes, they talk about, do you do a background check? Do you look at resumes? Do you do, what's your interview process? How many people do you require to have interviews go through, depending on the level of, technology that they're dealing with or seniority that you're dealing with. Those are all pretty standard questions. you can find that question in your SOC 2, you'll find it in the ISO framework, you'll find it in, CIS 20. All of them have some kind of like requirement that comes back to talking to HR.
So again, I think you made a key point there, right? Is your frameworks will drive what those integrations with other business partners look like. In this particular case, the question around HR.
Right. Yep.
Claude comes back and says, I work in a corporation. PII is a big piece that is huge that I see often, and staying compliant is there bigger pieces that you can highlight, I guess, in regards to, if you're just focused on PII, are there other bigger pieces that you could highlight inside of a corporation?
If you're focused on securing PII, I think then you probably would specifically want to look at your data handling classification standard that you have internally to try and figure out how to manage that in the way that aligns to what the company's saying that they're doing. A lot of times because that is something that's specifically called out in contractual obligations with your customers. So that's probably what I would say.
Do folks struggle with data governance?
Yes.
That was an incredible softball question.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, everywhere. I think, it just, data bleeds everywhere, right? So, I mean, realistically, it's really hard to figure out how to make sure that it's being gatekept in a way that is responsible across the board, I would say.
So Claude's looking at PII data and maybe some other parts that he doesn't know about. What are 3 things from a data governance perspective that Claude could walk into his company tomorrow to try to figure out if there's any other data that he needs to be looking at?
Data location, right? Like where your data sits is a requirement sometimes that people think about when it comes to governance. I would say data access, and then probably maybe data security. So like, are you encrypting your information? So, and how you're managing it from there, and where, basically where it sits. So locality is a big one because it's obviously tied to various regulations globally. So, yeah.
I think that's good. I think that's good. I know that's a conversation that I've been on the really bad side of several times. It's like we have no idea where all of our data is, or classification or anything else. How when it comes to data, just really quick, and something I've seen legal and cyber fight over who owns data governance.
What about the data governance team? I think it depends on the organization.
That's a good point.
I think it depends on what you're really trying to adhere to and what the goal of the organization is. I think if you are a data management organization, you're going to have a different perspective than if you're a medium-sized, security organization or security company. So, yeah, I think it depends.
I would think that would depend on the kind of company it is. Who should own it, right?
Yeah, so I mean, like a company like Informatica has a different perspective than when I went to Looker, for example. So, yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Fasochi Actual, our resident question dictionary. I give him crap because he literally drops in here and he's got like a notepad and he just like starts going down the questions. There's probably like 16 in queue from Fasochi right now.
The good thing is he only asks them once.
He does only ask them once. He's really good about that. Question is, what traits and behaviors make a bad GRC department?
Well, I think I kind of covered it a little bit, but I think having a very black and white view of the world and how things are able to be executed for a security team or even other departments that your requirements touch makes a bad GRC department, really. Yeah, and then somebody,
no such thing as a compensating control, for instance.
Yeah. Right. Or, the other thing is maybe the fact that there's too much like overhead and requirements for documentation and requirements for, those types of things. I think those drive me nuts as well, because you need speed to execution in some cases for the business, and like adding in layers of bureaucracy and requirements and paperwork is also a total, like, not a good thing in my book.
Total
So,
buzzkill to the whole organization. I
yeah.
think I think that's actually a really good point, though, right? Because I think if you've got a GRC department who's not thinking about the speed of cyber, you probably got some, you're an organization that might need some reshaping in there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're not sitting there putting too much work on the business that isn't valuable and that's just generating more work is not necessarily something that you want to be doing.
Oh, I think it's good feedback. BSEC comes through. This is talking back over to the legal and the JBS stuff. Shouldn't the lawyer PR for JBS just come out and say we will bring what happens once we know it all? We are not jumping to conclusions. Probably again talking more around public relations when it comes to disclosing breaches and disclosing data. And
I think
things
that's
like
kind
that.
of what they said.
Yeah,
To some extent.
Yeah,
I was going to say they probably did that, right? So
I think that I think we waver in this breach conversation, right? Because if it takes a week for them to come out and say we have nothing for you, we're still investigating, have a nice day. I think the cybersecurity community has a quick jump to conclusions, Matt, that says, well, they're not being transparent, they suck, tell us all the stuff. While I don't think that there's like a standard definition of when you should come out and say we have nothing, don't talk to us.
I don't think that there is a standard requirement for that other than like notifying your customers once it's formally declared a breach, right? And so that's probably what's happening in this case is that they're waffling on how they're going to declare it, right?
And on that note as well, in the U.S., isn't every state have their different reporting requirements?
Every state, and like who you also have to add to reporting and those types of things, yeah, and how it has to be reported. And even customer contracts might be like sufficiently different than what the state requirement is. Like we might need it to be 24 hours instead of the mandatory 48 or whatever. So yeah.
I went through a payment card breach a number of years ago, and I think that like I was a QSA for a long time, and knowing the PCI DSS was one thing, but then going through a payment card breach was another, and working with the legal team, realizing that they had to get the entire customer list of everything that had been breached, find out all the states that had customer data. Mm-hmm. And then individually figure out the reporting requirements for each of those individual states, and then do the reporting. I think that was a process. That
seems like the federal government should come in and just like.
I don't know. I was going to say it seems like a really good opportunity for a tabletop exercise ahead of time next time.
Oh, she drops in the tabletop exercise. Is that like elbow to the face? Why?
Playbook. Build a playbook. You wouldn't have that problem later. So
why are tabletops important? I'm asking you another softball question. Why are tabletops important?
Exactly for that reason, right? When you're in the middle, it's just like practicing. I don't know. Let's make a bad analogy. So war games in general allow people to practice ahead of time for when you're actually in the middle of the problem, right? So I think that that's essentially what it is, and it's not a time waster, but I think people feel like it is, right? Oh, we already know what we're going to do. Oh, we're all going to work from home. Oh, we're all going to do this, but in the middle of it, when people don't have that organization already, it can be overly stressful, and you may forget things that you wouldn't have otherwise done. So, yeah.
Who runs the tabletop? Is it Risk? Is it a third party? Is it incident response? Who should run the tabletop?
Usually in my experience, it's been IR, right? I mean, but it depends on the type of incident that you're talking about. So I've managed crisis management, and so we did all different other kinds of incidents that were not related to data breaches or anything in information security. So then you have to have different people in the room essentially to build those out. So yeah, it depends. But you would want specifically, maybe it's marketing that runs one because it's specifically related to corporate executive having a PR problem or something like that. So it depends. But in security, it's always, in my experience, been IR.
That's what I was going to say too, but I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't the only one thinking that. Tanawat comes through and says, is it a breach if no one declares it?
Does a tree fall in the woods?
I hate that question.
Right. Next question. No, I'm
Next
kidding.
question.
Oh, here we go.
See, there you go. My mods are listening like, oh, they said next question. We're pushing the next question button. That is a tough question, right?
It is. Yeah. I mean, and who really is the one that's declaring it? It usually has to come down from legal, right? So, yeah.
Which is why you got to call the lawyer first anyway.
Exactly. But I mean, it's amazing though that I've had to teach 2 Fortune 100 companies not to just be throwing around the word breach. Like,
oh yeah.
I mean, it's amazing how people are like I was at one organization who called me up and said, Neil, we had a breach. And I'm literally like, who called legal? Like, what is going on? And what it was somebody had clicked on a phishing email and they had determined that it was a breach. Self-determined.
No.
Yeah. That's
terrible.
But it's amazing, right? And people don't understand the implications of like the legal implications.
That specific. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So for the newbies out there, how do you define a breach?
Go
and
for it,
is it different state by state, or is a breach is a breach?
No, it really comes down to a couple of things. One would be like how you're classifying your information to determine. Yes, there's some regulatory scope there, specifically when it comes to personally identifiable information or personal, healthcare information or credit card information. Those are some of the common ones that people are saying, would be in the top 3 tier of information loss that would be considered a breach. But I think, in general, it really comes down, it's a consensus. It's got to be a consensus between the business, the security team, and legal to determine when it's actually considered a breach and if it's a material breach or if they're going to, do some dancing and say it's not a breach because of XYZ.
But doesn't that also depend? It varies based on industry because if I recall correctly, NERC, they have a much lower tolerance. So the Energy Regulatory Commission for the U.S. They have a much lower tolerance for what they determine a breach, which requires the energy companies to report breaches much more frequently.
Yeah, but I mean that makes sense, right? Because of the framework of what they're dealing with as far as infrastructure goes. So. Yeah, it would definitely be by industry. Obviously, if you have a credit card company or an e-commerce company and you're losing credit card data, that would be significantly damaging and you would have to determine when you're going to let people know. But yeah.
But this is also why it gets back to, this is why it's best to let the lawyers make that call and nobody else in the organization gets to make that call.
Right.
Yeah. And
you definitely don't want to be the people talking to your customers before that has happened.
You shake your head pretty vehemently. Have you been part of some pretty terrible incidents like that before?
I've seen some things happen where things that I felt should have been a breach were not declared a breach. So I think we've all maybe seen that too. Yeah.
I thought you were going to go with I cannot confirm or...
Sweet Delights comes through and says, this might be a kind of a dumb question. There are no dumb questions here, Sweet Delights, at all. I promise that. But who actually enforces governance? Wouldn't that kind of be a nightmare?
No, I mean, it's inherently built into the structure of how the organization functions, right, on some level. But then enforcement of governance, whether it's policy governance or, cultural governance, whatever, a lot of it is baked into different controls that you have, right, that you're outlined. And so in security specifically, a lot of it is baked into the controls that then you're reviewing at least annually.
Well, and I think you can still, at least in my experience, you can use IT audit as kind of like the hound dogs for people who aren't adhering to governance, right?
Sure. I mean, if you have that function within your organization, that definitely is the other handshake that happens, right? It's working with your audit team to go in and beat them up. So, yeah.
And wouldn't it differ based on how big of an issue it is, ranging from help desk to security operations center, or even, HR might get involved at some point, right?
Right. I mean,
it might depend on the situation, I would think.
Yeah, it's definitely not one team's job.
Yeah. I think that's a people's oftentimes misconceptions about governance is they're like, well, it's not a law, like who actually enforces it. I think that's that tight relationship that you keep referring to, right? Where, IT
Patty,
audit.
do you have a badge? Yeah,
Do
you carry a gun.
Right.
Did you when you were in IT audit? I think that's the beggar question right there.
You should ask Joel. I'm sure he would say yes.
It was self-appointed.
Ask Joel, he'd say yes.
Probably.
Did you smack Joel down a couple times?
No, it was just the way the organization was working at that time.
Tell us some Joel Fulton secrets. Tell us some Joel Fulton secrets.
I don't know. I really liked working with him, actually. He was always super funny, really nice, friendly. Some people in the security organization really hated IT audit, right? So they weren't, but I don't know. I always liked him, so I don't have any bad stories.
Other than he keeps talking about garbage jobs being my job.
He keeps referring to my job as a garbage job.
Well, somebody's got to take out the garbage, so
that's a good to have your head up on that one. Claw Overdraw comes back and says, what's the most common aspect of risk do companies fail on that get them in hot water, and what could they have done to avoid that pitfall?
It depends. I mean, if you're looking at recently, you see a lot of ransomware attacks. So, I mean, I would think that might be something that might be under risk register. And when those happen, it always makes me think, why didn't you have a BCP plan and a DR plan? Because then it wouldn't really matter if you needed to pay someone if you actually had decent backups. So
BCP, business continuity plan, DR, disaster recovery, just for those who are hearing the acronyms, wondering what they are.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. It's all right. You want to give a high-level overview real quick on BCP, DR, just for everybody who may not be familiar with that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the pandemic probably has given a lot of people a better understanding of business continuity, which means like when you are incapable of functioning at the organizational or even team level because of some type of incident, what's the plan to continue with business as usual in absence of some of the things that you would need to function. And then disaster recovery is recovering from a disaster, capability to, usually in technology anyway, it's the capability to bring your systems back up to operating capabilities within a certain amount of time. So you have like your return to operations timing that you usually try to adhere to. So.
And when we talk about disaster recovery, we're talking everything from a hurricane to ransomware to flooding to a tree falling through the roof.
Yeah, and business continuity would be like, even everybody working from home. A continuity program for COVID is working from home, right? So, I mean, a lot of people have been dealing with that this year.
Were you losing your mind when you saw all these companies trying to adapt to COVID and having like zero business continuity plan in place?
A little bit. I was like, are you kidding me? I mean, don't people sometimes work from their phone or whatever already and have internet? I mean,
the good news is now everybody has a business continuity plan.
Yes, I know. So
they may have developed it on the fly, but now they have it.
Business continuity was part of my responsibility at Informatica, and like before that at other organizations, trying to get like some teeth when you own business continuity was really hard. But the gentleman that worked for me now is like, oh, it's so great. I got people. I got, you got funding because of
all the things I needed to have.
So like, right.
It's all funded.
It's just like when you have now, but it took this pandemic to like put them in a positive position. So yeah.
The one silver lining of COVID. Thanks for giving one.
Right. I got a person. Awesome.
But I mean, look, the same thing gets said for cybersecurity, right? It takes a ransomware incident or a malware incident or a breach or something like that for people to be like, oh, we got to have an incident response plan.
Now we have an incident response plan and you need money. Let's fix this. Of course.
Take all the money.
This would have been a good idea to have 2 years ago. Okay.
And you're like, wait, I did ask for that. Here's the board deck that you said no to, right? So
what happens? Yeah. What happens? It's funny to talk about like, we're going to throw money at a problem because we realized that you asked for it 2 years ago and we never gave it to you. But then there's that atrophy that happens +3, +4, +5 after a breach, where they're like, well, I know we gave you a $50 million budget, but maybe we can start to scale that back a little bit more. Like, what is that conversation like? How do we stop that conversation from happening?
Well, it's probably a couple of things you definitely need to figure out.
Ooh, or
You
should
shouldn't.
we?
Should you stop the conversation from happening? Like what, clawing back funding that you're giving to the business? I mean, it's
Yeah, I
pretty
mean,
common,
isn't
right?
it realistic though? To the business says, okay, you got your arms around it, you've triaged the situation, but just like healthcare, you don't have to have them in the high cost bed. You move them to a different facility that's lower cost. Like,
Yeah, but
same
I
thing
would
with
say that is
security.
pretty common. Right, it is pretty common, right? Where they're saying, oh, here's all the money, but now you can't really show the return on investment. So maybe you actually don't need that much, right? Or you haven't been able to spend it all this year or get all your headcount, so you don't need it. I think that's any business unit, though, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they have like, so at the end of the day, I think the conversation really needs to be more about thinking about the bigger picture and the longer term picture of where it needs to go so that you can maintain your budget, right? And maintain your headcount, because it is really hard to hire security people. And it's really hard to like implement tools that make sense for the organization or change them once something's in that doesn't work anymore. So it's not a quick fix. So the quick fix is fixing the breach, right? But not fixing the longer term problems. That takes months and years. So yeah, I don't know, Neil, what do you think?
I was gonna say, but the devil's advocate part, the devil's advocate part of that though, right, is like, I mean, when you're post breach, and I've been in several of those before, right? There is no like, give me a minute to see if this is like the right 5-year plan. There is all this, like, hey, here's the 5-year plan. I'm going to ramp up to $50 million for a budget. I'm going to do this 10 million a year over the next 5 million. And then the conversation with the board is, well, if I do 20 million this year, can you accelerate the program by 2 years? Right?
Sure, of course it is.
And then you get to what you're talking about, where you don't spend the budget that year, you don't hire the headcount you want to, and then you're immediately behind the 8 ball because the organization wants you to accelerate. But to your point, it's hard to accelerate, especially on the headcount side in this industry.
I think in general, right? I mean, like even just putting in tools, you don't have the people that on your team that maybe know what to do with them. So then you're already behind there as well, right? Because it's a learning curve every single time you change things up. So yeah, and also I think it's unfortunate but it goes back to the fact that they don't understand how it works on the business side of security for running a team and implementing all these programs and implementing the capabilities that you need to manage the organization. So it comes back to some type of communication that maybe isn't at the technical speak level to make sure that they understand where you're going. And maybe that, yes, right after a breach, you can't really put together a new 5-year plan, but maybe you start with the one that you had already.
Yeah. KLA Flores 48 says, how have you built leadership capital? This is already starting out to look a good one. How have you built leadership capital when first working within a new org as GRC, considering the potential negative connotation that comes with the job?
Sure. So in my personal philosophy, I guess, is to be radically transparent. Some of the things that we talked a little bit about earlier include trying to get up to speed as quick as possible with how your product works, what your organization's doing, looking through all the documentation, and then having the conversations with the business counterparts about where the pain points are. And I think then starting to put together a plan of action that has, teeth to it to help fix those problems. And I think that that's probably where you gain the most trust out of the gate, and then showing execution and being able to get through them in the first 6 months. So it's not a 90-day plan. It's not a 30-day plan. It's really getting in there and knowing what the problems are right away, because you're getting hired for a reason, right? To fix the problem, and coming in with a plan out of the gate, looking at what the problems are, doing a reassessment of what your perspective is once you're in the organization, because people tell you what they think you want to hear in a interview. Then you get in and you find out, oh, this is really more screwed up than I thought. So just trying to go in and find out what the problems are, and really working with your counterparts to see what the solution potentially can be. And maybe that's go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say maybe at first it's a 10-point plan, and then you have the longer range plan to get things up to speed quickly and get your political capital working within your organization and your network, and then having the longer term goal of what you want to try to accomplish over time.
When we talk about that failure to execute piece of that. When you walk into a new org, are there quick kills, easy kills that you can almost take care of in every organization that help you build that political capital? And then there are things that you inherently know are longer burn, longer runways that kind of help you, maybe in the longer run. Is that something you've got in your playbook?
For sure. I mean, immediately every place you ever go to says, I want a unified controls framework. Every place, they don't want to keep getting hit by multiple frameworks with slightly different requirements, right? They want something that is inherently tailored to the organization that meets the intent of everything else. That's one. The other thing, of course, is putting together some actual valuable risk register and risk process versus red, yellow, green, or the 4x4 box, and then let's see how we're feeling today. So being able to start having a better conversation about risk management. And then probably the last thing is starting to figure out what the actual conversation is from a security awareness perspective, and looking at the trends within the organization. When you talk to your security operations counterparts about, how many times have we had phishing problems? How many emails are you getting from the organization where they're saying that they are pinging security app because they realized they clicked on something, or they got this funky email, or those types of things, and trying to build that knowledge within the organization, but using those metrics to kind of work with the teams to determine how to grow your capital within the organization.
I think that's a great question to end on for tonight. Oh, actually, sorry, I got one more push to me. You got a freebie in on that one as well. So I a little miscommunication from you there. Sergeant Shoddy says, how do you get the big dogs to define their crown jewels so you can do accurate risk assessments of a vulnerability? That's actually a really good one too.
That's a good question. Really, you need to come down to figuring out what the assets are that you're actually looking at within the landscape of your organization, and then determining at least what they believe it to be valued at, so that you can determine how to do the rest of your vulnerability assessment. So it's figuring out what the scope is, and trying to then figure out where the assets are sitting. I mean, there's multiple layers to it, but essentially it is figuring out exactly what the scope is, and really being clear on that and having everybody agree on it, so that you can continue down the line of trying to do your risk assessment.
Shouldn't you use, and maybe it's, maybe this is another softball, but shouldn't you use an existing ERM, if one exists, to kind of help you in your crown jewels assessment?
If one exists, I mean, a lot of times the security team's risk program and ERM are not always in lockstep at first, so that's probably something you would want to try to manage on the way to figuring that out as well.
So I did my own VUFA there, ERM's Enterprise Risk Management. Is that because Enterprise Risk Management was born out of the business continuity on the business side and not out of any type of risk management function inside of technology or security?
It could be. I mean, sometimes they are, one and the same, where, if you're at a technology organization, it might be one and the same. But essentially, usually it's because what they value and what they're looking at and who they're talking to are completely different than who you're working with. So the perspective is entirely different.
Okay. That I'm being reassured is definitively the last question for tonight. Patty, listen, amazing. I mean, it's just the wealth of knowledge that you've got here has been phenomenal. On behalf of myself and my moderators, I want to thank you so very much for coming in tonight. Jeff, any parting words from you real quick?
I actually just loved the fact that just like a few weeks ago, we were talking about getting with the chief marketing officer because there's value in brand, getting with the risk and compliance and governance people just because of the same reason. There's value in understanding what the assets are, what the crown jewels are, and communicating across the lines, and you're going to be able to get your projects funded more easily by partnering with those two.
Patty, any last remarks from you before I send you along your way for the evening?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody, and feel free to ping me on LinkedIn if anybody has a question. So.
I think I got a note from my team that there were, obviously we did drop your LinkedIn in chat. Everybody can hit !guest to get to your LinkedIn. I think it's requiring an email to connect with you on LinkedIn because of your privacy settings.
Oh yes, privacy.
Because your privacy settings.
It's like you take that seriously.
It's like you take that seriously.
I know. I can't believe it. What a joke.
Can we maybe get a lift on that for maybe the next 24 to 48 hours so folks can connect with you from the stream?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Yep. Continue to try to reach out to Patty. Patty, thank you so very much. I'm gonna put you back in the green room, but you can go on about your night, and you and I can sync up later in the week. I'll have Josh send an email out to you, and we can sync up later in the week. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight.
Thanks, guys.
Holy cow.
That was awesome.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, she's I don't know, maybe this is a degrading word, but she's a rock star. She might not want to be called a rock star. It's like, totally, I'm better than a rock star. Come on.
I can't even begin to say how awesome that conversation was. It was amazing.
Yeah, super practical. I love the fact that literally some of the first words out of her mouth was, if you want to get your projects funded, come talk to me.
Oh my God. I mean, no more. It doesn't get any more clear than that. It doesn't.
Yeah, that was awesome.
I know BSEC was hating as soon as she threw out the ROI verbiage on that one. He hates hearing that ROI thing, but it's true. It's what we keep talking about on stream. Like, I mean,
you might hate hearing about it, but if you don't start talking that way, you are never going to get anything funded, because that's how the business talks.
But I love that she came in and used the same language that we're trying to push down on the technical and the ops side, because it very much is true. Like that's how we have to start thinking to be successful in this space. Is we've got to start thinking the same language and the same speak that folks like Patty have figured out from working in IT audit and working in the business for years and years and years.
Well, and she also said something that resonated, and that is she just flat out read a ton and self-educated. Just go out there and do it, and she did. It was awesome.
Yeah. What's your big takeaway for tonight? I think it's probably the if you want to get your projects funded, talk to me.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Jeff, another
for up-to-the-minute cybersecurity news, make sure you follow and subscribe to the Cyber and Security channel on Twitch and YouTube. Also, make sure you turn on those notifications so that you know when we go live.